Um, Hellen is a woman very passionate about rugby. I'll start with rugby because that is my major passion. But I'm also a strength and conditioning coach, and I can do strength and conditioning for pretty much any sport because I received training for um, general S&C, so it's not limited to rugby alone. I love cats a lot, and I love reading novels whenever I have time. My nose is always stuck in a novel. I don't really watch TV unless I'm watching rugby. And I'm also involved in an organization known as Rugby Tackling Life that uses rugby as a tool, a vehicle more or less, to empower girls and also educate boys, basically about sexual reproductive health, healthy relationships. And one of our biggest focuses is on child marriage in two sub-counties in Kitgum district. There was no inspiration to get into sports, you could say, per se. I grew up in a sports-loving family. My dad was into sports, and he encouraged us to play sports. So we were always outside during the weekends or during the holidays, playing something, climbing trees, running around, riding bicycles, and that sort of thing. He would always come for our sports days. He would take part in the parents, teachers, races, or whatever there was to have. And yeah, so I guess you could say it was my dad's influence. And then my older siblings also were heavily involved in sports. So it's just something I grew up doing. There actually wasn't a transition from rugby to football because in rugby, I'm a rugby player, rugby coach, and I also do strength and conditioning. When it comes to football, I don't know much about football, and I'm not involved in football coaching. I do purely the strength and conditioning. And football strength and conditioning, as much as it's different from rugby, there are very many things which are the same. In fact, you'd say quite a lot of the conditioning that I do for rugby sevens, I carry into football because of the kind of fitness required, the explosive speeds that are required. Of course, football doesn't have the real contact that rugby has, so there's less emphasis on that. But then there is some small element of contact in football. And rugby sevens has a lot less contact than 15s. So a lot of the things just like go together, you know. Yeah, so in football, I'm purely S&C. Yeah, joining Express FC as part of the technical team, of course, there are lots of eyebrows raised. The first thing is I'm a woman, and football is a male-dominated sport. I mean, when you look at the football teams, clubs, or national teams, they're coached by men. Most of the technical staff are men. If women are involved, it's usually as team managers or medics. There are very few female football coaches. I know there are some, but they're not that many. So, of course, being on the technical team of a male football team, especially one in the Premiership, of course, there were questions like, what is she doing there? Does she really know what she's doing? And then the fact that I come from a rugby background and I have zero football background also raised eyebrows. So it was basically having to prove myself, but I'm used to that because of even in the rugby world, I had to prove myself. So the challenges were getting the players and the other technical members to see my value. But I know what I'm doing, so it took a short time to be able to do that. Some of the challenges I think I found where the football culture is a lot different from the rugby culture. So making that adjustment was different. Football is a professional sport. Rugby, it's amateur, so we train during the day. You have midweek matches. Then rugby usually have one match a week. Football, there are two matches that you have in a week. So you really have to do a lot when it comes to the conditioning of the players and even their recovery. And then the hooliganism in football just blew me away. You know, it was so different to the kind of atmosphere that we have in rugby games. Then let's see, what other challenges? I think those would be the major challenges. Then as much as football is a professional sport, I think it's not run professionally. So the weird things such as witchcraft come up quite a bit in football, which I find quite funny, and it's also disruptive as well. You don't get that in rugby. If it's there, it's on a very small scale. Yeah, so like I said, I think mainly the culture and just having to prove myself. So those would be I think the major challenges that I faced initially. The growth of women's rugby in Uganda is very slow. When you think that Uganda qualified for a World Cup in 2009, and at that point there were, I think it was two or three rugby teams in the country. There were three actually. And when you look at the number of rugby teams in the country now, the number hasn't really grown. We have a league which is predominantly based in central Uganda, yet there's a lot of raw talent in northern Uganda and eastern Uganda. And as much as there are leagues going on there, there's so stop-start, and there are a lot of walkovers which are awarded, usually because of money, or teams are not able to raise players. And then the quality of rugby upcountry is generally low because of the technical knowledge that they have there is low. You know, most of the top coaches, if not all, come from the central region, and perhaps you could say Ginger as well. And so the players upcountry are suffering because technically their rugby is not up there. They have the physique, they've got the passion, they've got the athleticism, but just the technical aspects of rugby are letting them down. They're poorly coached. So I think women's rugby hasn't grown as much as it should have, though the positives are that we're starting to have schoolgirl rugby competitions, which is a huge plus. So if that can happen, then we can soon eventually be able to have inter-university competitions. At least Makerere University has a rugby team and has taken part in rugby university competitions, but we need more universities in the country playing, you know. And then when we have proper competitions in secondary school, university, then at club level, we can truly say that women's rugby has grown in Uganda. The unique challenges are, again, rugby is a male-dominated sport, so most of the coaches are male. And coaches tend to think that women are smaller versions of men. And so they coach them as if they're men. And both the strength and conditioning, even the style of rugby, and that doesn't work, you know. They need to distinguish between men and women and the approaches to women's rugby than to men's rugby. No one is saying women shouldn't train just as hard, but the style of play is so different. Even when you watch women's international rugby, you can see the style of play for the top teams like New Zealand, England, France, for the women is way different from their men. And even World Rugby has done studies where in the women's game, there's less kicking. The ball is in play for a lot longer than in men's rugby. And then even when it comes to injuries, women are actually more susceptible to concussion, and that's just due to our biology. Because you could say women tend to take less contact in rugby than men do. And we know contact is one of the huge risk factors of concussion, yet we're still more at risk, and it's simply just due to our biology. So these are things which need to be factored in. When it comes to injury, women are more susceptible to knee injuries than men are, and that's something which needs to be taken into account. Another of the unique challenges is women get pregnant and men don't, and this is something which isn't factored in. So there are usually huge turnovers every year when it comes to women's sport. Sometimes it's pregnancy, sometimes it's other reasons, simply it could be school or work. Rugby being an amateur sport, for both men and women. Can you imagine the male game doesn't have sufficient money to keep it running? We keep hearing complaints from the men. Women's rugby gets even less money, so it's even worse for the women. Then the perception people have about women's rugby. They think women shouldn't be playing rugby. So already women have a hurdle when it comes to playing rugby, than a bigger hurdle than men do. Some of the things you should do is get more women involved in rugby. And it doesn't necessarily mean as players. URU has done a good job trying to get women into match officiation, trying to get them into coaching. But the challenge that I see with the approach is women do these courses and then there's no follow-up, you know. There's no support to keep the women as match officials or as coaches. And then another thing is the grassroots. It's important to get girls playing at primary school level, then secondary school level as well, so that from primary school, girls will be able to join a school that has rugby. Then also tertiary institutes as well. So at university, girls are not dropping out. They still can play. And then at club level as well. So there needs to be a deliberate target, a different like marketing approach than there is for men's rugby. And then competitions. It's very frustrating to train and then not play. And so you'll find there's a high dropout rate. You can get girls training, but then when you don't get them playing, they drop out. And they end up playing sports like football, where there's a lot of football competitions. Netball, there are a lot of netball competitions, and basketball. There are a lot of basketball competitions. And oddly enough, even cricket has very many competitions for girls and women. So unless URU gets, it's one thing to get girls into the game, but how do we retain them there? And the only way to retain players is through them playing in competitions.